What do the terms East and West mean to you? To most, they may just seem like two cardinal directions. But in geopolitics, the term East and West mean, well, it's complicated. Allow me to explain. Chapter 1, Ancient West. The initial distinction between Western and Eastern civilizations was mostly a cultural one. During the Greco-Persian Wars, with the Greeks representing the liberty-fighting democratic society, as Greece was the birthplace of democracy, and the Persian Empire representing a more authoritative and autocratic approach to power. And despite being the much smaller entity, the Greeks actually came out victorious. This was also maybe where you can attribute the West's superiority complex, as this was a huge ego boost for the ancient Greek society as a whole. And for many centuries, it was viewed as the hotbed for scholars, philosophy, art, and the like, especially Athens. Chapter 2. The schisms. Although with the Greeks being the OG West, this kind of got flipped on its head, especially with the Great Schism. And for those of you who are unaware, this is when the Catholic Church split from the Orthodox. So now the formerly cultural divide of the East and West has shifted to a religious one, making the West the Catholic nations and the East being the Orthodox nations. Chapter 3. The Reformations. Chapter 3 is a continuation of the religious divide, except now it's the Protestant Reformation. This is sort of where you begin to see our modern understanding of the West start to form, with the West now consisting of England with the Anglicans, France and the Netherlands with the Calvinists, and the Holy Roman Empire, that's just Germany, and the Nordics with the Lutherans. This then leaves the remaining Catholic nations with this weird in-between area, and on the geopolitical compass, I would put them in the middle, sort of in this weird gray area. Chapter 4. The World Wars. Okay, so I gotta be honest, this is where the East and West divide is at its most useless, as it really wasn't a divide between Eastern and Western societies anymore. The divide was more about the question of, do you side with the Germans or not? Do you side with the Germans or not? Chapter 5. Communism v. Capitalism. With the world wars having the East and West divide become seemingly obsolete, the same cannot be said about the Cold War. This is arguably when the East and West were at its most clear and concise and most relevant. It's also where you start to hear the terms First World, Capitalist World, Free World, and other synonymous terms, whereas with the East, you hear terms like the Second World, Communist World, Socialist Bloc, and even perhaps Behind the Iron Curtain. The East and West consisted of many countries, but for the most part, the East was the USSR, and the West was the USA. Chapter 6. The Economic Period. Chapter 6 is where we stand today, and this distinction of the East and West divide is mostly in regard to economics. Technically, Chapter 5 was also economics, but nowadays there's more of a focus on trade blocks rather than military blocks, chiefly with the West being represented by the G7 and the East being represented by the BRICS. Now, Chapter 6 also brings another element about the global compass, and that is the global North and global South, completing the compass analogy. Now, the global North you can basically just use interchangeably with the West most of the time, but for the global South, it's sort of a different case. Latin America is not typically considered the West per se, as most would rather describe it as the global South, as theoretically it should be considered the West, as it's mostly a democratic and capitalist region of the world, but its economic prowess is just not on par with the traditional West and global North. Although Latin America's exclusion from the West could also be attributed to a carryover from the Schism chapter, as nearly all Latin American countries are largely Catholic. Just like how I spoke earlier, how the Catholic states were sort of like this weird gray area and would be in the middle of the compass. Now that the North and South have an established identity, this is where most of the Latin American countries would now be placed. And that's all the 6 chapters.